Good evening, everyone. Well, it's time for our midweek lesson, and we're beginning the book of Second Corinthians tonight. And so tonight I'll start out with just an introduction and an overview of the whole book, and then we'll probably, if we have time, we'll do chapter 1, but if not, then we'll do chapter 1 next week. Just do this introduction. And the author of this book is Paul, and is also Timothy is another author in it. There's external testimonies for its genuineness, and that includes statements by Irenaeus against heresies, Athenagoras of the resurrection of the dead, Clement of Alexandria, and that's in Melissenaries, and Tertullian on modesty. And these are all outside sources. These are other people have referred to the fact that Paul was the author of this book. Now, where was this written? Somewhere in Macedonia, while Paul was on his way to make another visit to Corinth. This would be during his third missionary journey, in a part of which Luke says very little, and that's see Acts 21 and 2 about that. Now, the time of this writing, probably in the fall of 57 AD, making it but a few months after writing 1 Corinthians, which was likely written in the spring of AD 57. Now, the messenger was Titus, who was accompanied by two others on his journey. And that we see that in chapter 8, verse 16 through 24. Now, the background of the epistle. Now, the church at Corinth began in 52 AD. Remember, this is written in 57 AD, so the church was 5 years old, when Paul visited there on his second missionary journey. It was then that he stayed 1.5 years, the first time he was allowed to stay in one place as long as he wished. The record of this visit and the establishment of the church is found in Acts 18, verses 1 through 18. The second letter of Paul to the Corinthian church was occasioned by the report brought back by Titus, who informed Paul that their reception of the first letter and how they received the rebuke that letter contained. And that's chapter 2, 12 and 13, chapter 7, 5 through 9. Now, the purpose of the epistle. Titus's report was encouraging, but evidently it also brought troubling news that some at Corinth were questioning Paul's authority as an apostle. The doubt may have been planted by Judaizing teachers, who seemed to follow Paul and attempted to undermine his teachings concerning the law. They appear to have questioned his veracity, that's chapter 1, 15 through 17, his speaking ability, which is chapter 10, verse 10, chapter 11, verse 6, and his unwillingness to accept support from the church at Corinth. That's 11, 7 through 9, and 12, verse 13. There were also some people who had not repented of their licentious behavior. We see that in chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. Paul's primary purpose, then, in this epistle is to vindicate his apostleship and the manner of life. This is where he's justifying himself and his purpose as an apostle. He hopes that by writing in advance of his visit, he can get all of the necessary rebuke out of the way. We see that in chapter 1, 23, chapter 2, verse 3, chapter 13, verse 10. He also uses the opportunity to encourage them to have the collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem ready when he comes. That's chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, And then also it's a reference back to 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Now, this letter is the most biographical and least doctrinal of Paul's epistles. It tells us more about Paul as a person and as a minister than any of the others. Those who would be ministers of the gospel would do well to carefully study it, along with Paul's epistles to Timothy and Titus. Now, the key verse in this 2 Corinthian letter is chapter 7, verse 2. And it reads, "Open your heart to us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have defrauded no one." It's an appeal for acceptance by the church. So, that's a general overview of the book. Let's go through a brief outline, going through the different chapters and seeing the main highlights and the main objectives and the purposes of the different chapters. Starts out with a salutation and thanksgiving. And this is chapter 1, and it's verses 1 through 11. Next, Paul explains his ministry of reconciliation. And that goes from chapter 1, verse 12, and into 7, verse 16. He starts out defending his integrity. He talks about the changed plan, chapter 1, 12 through 22. He talks about his delayed visit, which is chapter 1, verses 23 through chapter 2, verse 4. Then he goes into the penitent offender, chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. The next thing he does is he describes his apostolic ministry. He describes it as triumphant, chapter 2, starting in verse 12. He talks about it being accredited, chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. He talks about it being glorious. That's chapter 3, 4 through 18. He talks about it being honest, chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. He talks about his suffering, chapter 4, verses 7 through 18. He talks about it being hopeful, chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. He talks about its ministry being devoted, chapter 5, 11 through 17. He talks about it being reconciling, 5, 18 through 21. And he talks about his ministry being approved, chapter 6, the first 10 verses. He also makes his appeal to them. His appeal, first, to open their hearts, chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. He asks them to be separate from the world, chapter 6, verses 14 through chapter 7, verse 1. He talks about comfort and confidence that they have given him. And that starts in chapter 7, verse 2, and goes through verse 16. He then talks about the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. And this is chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, and then verse 15. So, it starts out with the example of Macedonia, and that's 8, verses 1 through 5. Then he talks about the basis for his exhortation, chapter 8, verses 6 through 15. Next, he goes about telling about the messengers for his ministry. This is chapter 8, verse 16 through chapter 9, verse 5. Then he deals with the encouragement that he is asking for them to give liberally. That's chapter 9, verses 6 through 15. Paul defends his apostleship and authority next, and that starts out in chapter 10. And it starts out with an explanation concerning his conduct. He uses weapons mighty in God and that's chapter 10, verses 1 through 11. He talks about the contrast between him and his opponents. Chapter 10, verses 7 through 18. He talks about some foolish boasting and the necessity for boasting. 11, 1 through 21. The grounds for his boasting. 11, 22 through chapter 12, verse 10. And his rebuke for compelling him to boast. And that is chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. Then he gives his final warning. Motivated by love, he seeks their edification. Chapter 12, verses 14 through 19. His fear of what he will find. Chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. His coming will be in judgment if necessary. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 6. But he hopes to avoid sharp words by writing in advance. That's chapter 13, verses 7 through 10. Remember, he talked about having to clear up all the rebuke before he ever gets there. So, the last part of the book is the concluding exhortations and the benediction. That's chapter 13, verses 7 through 10. So, here's a couple of questions and some answers for talking about this introduction. Which journey did Paul establish the church in Corinth? His second journey. And where does one read about the establishment of the church in Corinth? Acts 18, the first 18 verses. On which journey did Paul write both of his epistles to the Corinthians? This was on his third journey. From where did Paul write his first epistle to the Corinthians? That was in Ephesus. From where did he write the second epistle to the Corinthians? Somewhere in Macedonia. Perhaps Philippi, perhaps Thessalonica, or Berea. What is the approximate date of the writing? Remember, we talked about it. It was the fall of AD 57. Whose arrival likely prompted Paul's writing of this epistle? And this is chapter 7, verses 5 through 7. He talks about it where it's Titus. What sorts of things about Paul were questioned by those challenging his apostleship and his authority? His veracity, his speaking ability, and his refusal to accept financial support. What was the purpose of this epistle? To vindicate Paul's apostleship and the manner of his life. What other people did Paul discuss in this epistle? What other topic did he discuss? Chapter 9, verse 1, he talks about the collection for the saints. So that's a brief introduction on the 2 Corinthians. We'll start next week with chapter 1, and we'll continue through it till we finish the 2 Corinthians letter. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and bless you.